Untold radio perks and to support our channel, introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, greetings to all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Happy New Year to you all. And thank you for joining me on Talking Weird for the Untold Radio Network. It's lovely to see many of the good shows and some personal friends of mine in the chat. I appreciate everybody who is here. I will get to questions and comments in the chat, probably in chapters tonight. For those of you who didn't read the show notes, it's just me solo. I'm going to be kind of workshopping and going over a chapter in a book I've been working on for a long time about UFO belief and also about the nature of UFOs and the UFO phenomenon. It's based partly on my PhD dissertation on American UFO belief, but while that was more of a social history about what people believe, this book lets me be a little bit, I suppose, crazier and drift into some more hypothetical things that frankly I couldn't have got away in the history department of the University of Sydney, and perhaps for good reason, because as we all know, despite people claiming to be experts on the UFO topic, none of us really know anything, except perhaps we can record it historically and perhaps we can take some somewhat educated guesses at what the phenomenon is. So if you ask a question, I will get back to it. I'm going to check back between sections of the presentation that I'm about to do, and between each one I'll go back and see, okay, somebody's had a question, okay, Ken, or okay, you know, who else is in the chat tonight? Nancy or Horace or Ed or anybody who's likely watching or listening, or anybody who's never jumped into the chat before. Feel free to ask me some questions and comment on what I'm suggesting. I'm not really working on this book much at the moment. I'm so busy with my documentary on Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, which you can go and check out at theshavermystery.com, which will take you to the Facebook page, that I don't have a whole lot of time to work on the book, but the book's sitting there and occasionally I pull it out and have a little bit of a look at it. And this is one of the chapters that I think about the most when I'm not actually working on it. So I suppose with that, thank you everybody for joining us, and let's jump right in. I start this with a quote from G.K. Chesterton, which I think is kind of telling this chapter. So when I read it to you, realize that I agree with him. He's talking about spirits here. I think he had some experiences with the paranormal and seances and the like, but I think it applies equally to the UFO phenomenon. And Chesterton wrote, "Whether it is produced by some subconscious but still human force, or by some powers good, bad, or indifferent, which are external to humanity, I would not myself attempt to decide. The only thing I will say with complete confidence about that mystic and invisible power is that it tells lies." And I think the theme of deception runs throughout not only the book I'm working on, particularly this chapter, but my general thoughts about the UFOs. As anybody who watches this show regularly or listens to me on any other shows, I take a lot of it not at face value, but I suspect that we're being lied to. And this chapter isn't about what some of you have heard me talk about regarding the type of deception which is spun by the intelligence community. This is more about if we think there's an actual phenomenon, if there is a phenomenon which isn't a human intelligence, what could it be? Anyway, it starts with this chapter, or this section anyway, which I called A Clown Called Funbo. Imagine you're a child playing in a suburban yard. A van pulls up on the street out front. A friendly looking clown dressed in a rainbow of colours leans out the driver's window. "Hey kid, I'm Funbo the Clown," exclaims the smiling harlequin. "I've got a bunch of puppies and kitties and candy in the back. We're all driving to my home in Disneyland for a special party. Jump in. It's going to be fun." Would it be a good idea to trust Funbo and get into his creeper van? Hopefully, when you were a child, your parents had warned you about strangers. And if you now have children, hopefully you proffer similar advice to your own offspring. I had a Funbo type encounter myself when I was a boy, and the driver wasn't dressed like a clown, but my parents had warned me enough about such monsters, regardless of whatever deceitful guise they were wearing. So I ran back towards my house yelling for help, and the predator sped away. And if I hadn't been warned, maybe I wouldn't be here talking to you all today. Now, imagine, though, for a sickening moment that a boy was taken by Funbo. If he was fortunate enough to later escape or be released and then told his parents about his abuser, would anyone think that the child had been abducted by a clown whose driver's license read "Name Funbo the Clown, address 1313 Disneyland Drive, Anaheim, California, zip code 92802"? No, of course they wouldn't think that. But let's even pull that encounter back a level. Just imagine a creepy guy dressed as a clown approaching kids playing at a local park, introducing himself as Funbo the Clown from Disneyland. No abduction this time, just unsettling encounters with this weird clown. Now, if some of the children later told their parents, and their parents in turn reported the encounters to the authorities, the police sure as heck wouldn't start canvassing Disneyland for a resident clown named Funbo. Instead, they'd work towards finding out the real identity of the potential predator behind the makeup and where he really came from. Now, I want you to do a little thought experiment with me while we're here. So now, since we're playing Let's Imagine, let's extend it a little bit. Now, imagine that you're entering a different and a more anomalous landscape. Picture driving along a back road tonight. Your car's headlights are all that illuminate the rural darkness. That is until a bright light in the sky catches your attention. The light follows your car. You see it land in a roadside field. It's a classic saucer-shaped object. You even watch as diminutive humanoid occupants exit the craft. It's all very strange and troublesome. It bothers you. This intrusion into your reality. When you were a child, your parents and teachers had warned you about stranger danger, but neither in childhood nor in adulthood had you been advised on how to deal with such an experience, nor were you warned of the dangers that it could pose. As we will see, older folklores did prepare people for such dealings, and many of these traditions, like Ireland's fairy faith, also cautioned that things seen or experienced when encountering the other crowd, i.e. the fairies, it might not be real. Everything could be an intentional deception when you encounter the fairies. A shiny fairy palace might just be a dank cavern. The magnificent feast served within, no more than piles of horse dung. Its beautiful and ethereal residents could be disguised old hags and grotesque goblins. And we'll talk more on the fair folk and their glamour later as we're chatting tonight. But the point to take away from this now is this: if you were raised in the fairy faith of the Emerald Isle, you would have known not to trust what the good neighbors told you or showed you, just as a modern child well schooled in stranger danger knows not to trust the buttery promises nor wholesome facade of a pedophile in a creeper van. But your modern outlook knows no alternative but to literalize an anomalous encounter. So you take it at face value. Seeing is believing, right? You know what you saw, and what you saw was an advanced metallic craft from a distant world carrying its extraterrestrial crew on an interplanetary mission to this planet. Decades of sci-fi imagery and popular tropes that already set you up to reach this conclusion. Now, if you tell your story to a sympathetic ear, perhaps to a friend who is into UFOs or a civilian UFO research group, chances are your pop culture infused interpretation will only be affirmed and validated. Worse still, imagine that your experience on that dark byway keeps niggling away at you, okay? Its memory gives you no peace. It turns out that your unexpected encounter with the unexplained shook you at a deep and existential level. Maybe you start to have trouble sleeping, or your nightmares become focused on that weird event, or you become fearful of driving at night. So you decide to seek out a mental health professional who deals with these type of UFO experiences. And when you mention your decision to your UFO hobbyist friend, he recommends someone he saw lecturing about alien contact at a paranormal conference. Alternatively, you might hear a sympathetic sounding hypnotherapist on a late night radio show or a podcast like this one, talking about helping people come to grips with their close encounters. Perhaps in your ever-encompassing research efforts to make sense of your experience, you discover a book which that same hypnotherapist wrote on the topic. Or maybe if you contacted a civilian UFO group, they refer you to this hypnotherapist. At any rate, I already in other parts of the book have looked where this is likely to end. And I've talked about it on multiple episodes of this show, the dangers of hypnosis. And our regular listener and guest on this show, Ed Schultz, who's a trained hypnotherapist, will warn you about the dangers of using hypnosis to recover these type of memories as well. And so, sure enough, after you've had some hypnoregression sessions with said therapist, you now know that you're an alien abductee, and your one brief brush with the numinous ends up changing your life, your beliefs, and your very concepts of self and reality forever. Okay, so that little imaginal game we were playing is over, but it's an accurate encapsulation of the process, framing many such real life experiences and how an initial event can ferment and mushroom in the experiencer's psyche, often with external help. So let's be clear, and this isn't a popular thing to say in the community which many of us, exist in, affirming the proclamations and visages presented by an unknown phenomenon to a UFO experiencer is about as helpful as agreeing with the Funbo victim that his abductor was a clown who lives in Disneyland. The flip side, of course, is that if there was a genuine experiential basis to a particular UFO experience, then telling the experiencer that her encounter was just a figment of her imagination might be as damaging as telling a victim of our theoretical clown predator that he had simply imagined his abuser. Because after all, we know that there is no such thing as a pederast clown called Funbo who lives in Disneyland. Just as many of us tracking the history of the UFO phenomenon doubt that Zeta Reticulans are visiting and kidnapping Earthlings. So tonight's presentation is going to kind of be put together in the spirit of, if this is real, then what is it? By which I mean, if some close encounters do have an external conscious agency, what then is that agency, or what might that agency be? Now, a plethora of UFO books authored by die-hard proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis assert to know what the agency is behind the flying saucer phenomenon, i.e. humanoid extraterrestrial visitors. At best, such authors have little more than anecdotal evidence to support their conclusions, namely testimony from UFO witnesses or experiencers, often prompted or reinterpreted by the authors themselves, claiming that the beings encountered were extraterrestrials. It's kind of like if a researcher in our Funbo allegory interviewed the boy abducted by Funbo, and then based on the lad's recollections wrote a book asserting the existence of Disneyland's pederast clown. Now, to be clear, if there is a conscious external agency behind the UFO experience, I don't know myself with any degree of certainty what it is, but I can say with a high degree of certainty what it is not. Now, in both my PhD and my master's thesis, and multiple times on this show and on other people's shows, I've traced that there's this almost ubiquitous belief that UFOs and metallic extraterrestrial spaceships gradually emerged in the late 40s into the early 50s and became inseparable from the period science fiction tropes and its social concerns. This new mythology was further developed by hoaxes, intelligence operations, and dubious pseudo-therapeutical practices, which we were mentioning before, all the while shifting and keeping pace with powerful cultural undercurrents. So whatever the phenomenon is, the UFO phenomenon, it isn't what the X-Files type UFO belief has taught us. It isn't part of some cosmic conspiracy involving extraterrestrial hybridization programs, an MJ-12 style shadow government, reverse engineered flying saucers, and underground bases shed by aliens in the US military, unless that is the hoaxes and spin and confabulations and cultural currents and science fiction tropes all just fell into perfect alignment and mirrored the exact reality of the phenomenon, which to me at least seems pretty unlikely. That said, if there is a conscious non-human agency behind the flying saucers, it could be an extraterrestrial force playing its own deceptive game, in which case it might behave in the way it would expect us to believe that it would behave. So it may be an extraterrestrial force, but we're about to look at that now, what that could mean, but also in the spirit, I suppose, of the terrible story of Funbo and with the idea of a Funbo lineup, just imagine that there might be some other suspects that are a little closer to home and a little more in line with some long-reaching traditions and beliefs about non-human intelligences. And we'll get to that after we look at the extraterrestrial model. But first, I might jump in and see if anybody has any questions. Horace Smith, Professor Emeritus of Astronomy and Physics at Michigan State University, says the clown has a human if terrible motivation. Understanding the motivation of an elf or UFO inhabitant is harder, unless perhaps it comes from the human consciousness. That's an excellent point. And I agree with it. That's why it's even more difficult to determine some of this. So let's jump into the extraterrestrial intelligence possibility, or what I think it might mean if it is extraterrestrial. Now, our concept of extraterrestrial life has been molded and remolded by over a century worth of science fiction, along with thousands of UFO reports chronicled by writers and documentarians from the 1940s to the present. In fact, if you look at Charles Fort, this goes back even further. It goes another 20 years backwards. And Chris Orbeck, in his recent excellent book on flying saucers, has pointed out that these beliefs extend even further back. But mainly from the 40s forward, perhaps, is where we get so much of this. And even a halfway astute researcher who bothers to trace the history of encounters and beliefs within a broader context will see how the UFO phenomenon seems to shift and keep pace with the general culture. Not just UFO belief, indeed, but the very manifestations of the phenomena as reported by witnesses and experiences also tends to keep pace with our current technological and cultural assumptions or preconceptions. But so the anthropogenic bias that sees ETs as essentially human, just with slightly different minor discrepancies, usually like features which are slightly off or slightly varying heights, but in some ways comes from the Hollywood practicality that you have to put men in suits to, you have to cast people opposite Captain Kirk or anybody else. You're going to use humans. You've got to fit a kind of a suit that fits on them. So it kind of works for special effects units to write stories around aliens which are essentially the same as us, right? But this anthropogenic appearance, nature and motives of the aliens, as reported by experiencers and recorded in UFO lore, is perhaps one of the leading indicators of our own cultural bias and the expectations being reflected back to us. Now, if a genuine extraterrestrial intelligence is communicating with us, it may be truly alien. It may be of a shape or type or nature beyond our imagination, perhaps even exist outside our limited perception. And if so, it may choose to present in a manner more palpable to human expectations, i.e., for the last few decades as little grey men. And prior to the cultural primacy of that alien motif, the little grey alien, there was an assortment of sci-fi and horror film type monsters which regaled witnesses in earlier years. I mean, think of Flatwoods. It was the Frankenstein monster was popular. It was the Flatwood monster. Hopkinsville, there was Hopkinsville goblins. Everybody understood what goblins were, or even the famous Pascagoula abduction. They were mummies. They were described as like mummies, or as beatific, angel-like ETs, a la Michael Rennie in The Day the Earth Stood Still, or the flaxen-haired space brothers of George Adamski and the other contactees. So we used to see these creatures more within, or describe them at least, more within the context of other paranormal ideas and fiction that we were used to before the prevalence of UFO depictions so much in a lot of popular culture. And any more speculation of that from me would probably be just more speculation. But it's worth considering that a real alien intelligence may look and behave nothing like how science fiction has imagineered that concept in our popular consciousness, or at least most science fiction, that is. In a few minutes, when we're looking at more Gnostic simulation type suggestions, which we'll get to in a minute, I think you'll find that pretty interesting. I do. The experiences and exegesis of science fiction giant Philip K. Dick will come to the foreground. Now, we'll concentrate on the more overtly spiritual aspects of an intelligence that he termed variously Valis or zebra. And as we will see, while Dick imagined that Valis was a living divinity, he also played with the idea that it may have been an extraterrestrial satellite transmitting messages to liberate us from our earthbound reality. Now, another influential science fiction book and film suggested something similar. In 1968, Arthur C. Clarke's novel 2001: A Space Odyssey and the classic Stanley Kubrick film version imagined that a mysterious black obelisk was able to manipulate human consciousness and evolution. Its influence drove our species ever onwards and upwards towards the stars. Now, John Keel ran with this idea. John Keel, of course, is the author of Mothman Prophecies and one of the most significant people writing in this space in its history. So he played with this idea in his classic work, The Eighth Tower. But rather imagining the force as extraterrestrial in origin, Keel repurposed the obelisk as an allegory for his concept of the superspectrum, which is an impersonal energy field which explained most paranormal, religious, and UFO phenomena, according to Keel. Keel similarly described this non-human power as driving human history and belief, just like the obelisk did in 2001. Now, science fiction historian, so this is somebody outside of the UFO space, his name is John Brosnan, and he interpreted the film in much the same way, describing its plot as revolving around, and he wrote, cold, impersonal entities playing some kind of cosmic game with mankind for incomprehensible reasons of their own. And anyone familiar with Keel's work or the Phil Mothman prophecies is very aware of how Brosnan's description of 2001 resonates through this type of UFO interpretation. Now, the nature of any intelligence so alien to our own usual anthropocentric expectation of the other, be it P.K. Dick's Valis, Kubrick's Black Obelisk, or Keel's Eighth Tower, might prove unknowable. It might be extraterrestrial, but the alternatives that we'll begin to examine tonight are no less probable. Regardless of hypothesized origin, all have been described as communicating with us via mythological projections and bioelectromagnetic emissions. Influential alien abductee and author Whitley Strieber has mentioned, and I quote from him, that his visitors used very few words to communicate. Their primary method was a sort of theatrical demonstration, richly endowed with symbolic meaning. Thinkers from Carl Jung through Keith Thompson to Thomas Bullard have noted the seeming mythic messaging and communication embedded in UFO experiences. And to me, it seems like it's a kind of a one-sided communication designed to elicit a reaction from us more than a conversation. It's not that our voice goes unheard in these engagements. Indeed, our own cultural and psychological expectations seem to be echoed back to us. In other words, we are hearing ourselves in said messages as much as we are hearing the other. But is the other listening to us in return, whatever the other is? Is it hoping for a dialogue? Even that concept starts to slide us again towards anthropomorphism. Besides, whatever the other is, nothing suggests that it is listening. Elsewhere in the Eighth Tower, Keels imagines this messenger as akin to a great phonograph in the sky, something that throughout human history has spun the same message for us over and over, again and again. But maybe this ancient power is more like a broadcast station than a record player. And if so, maybe humans are receivers, not transceivers. We are like shortwave radio sets picking up a cryptic signal, but without the means to transmit a reply. Then again, whatever it is, be it extraterrestrial satellite, divine living plasma, manifestation of the superspectrum, or something equally impenetrable, it could be awaiting for a specific response from us that we are yet and perhaps always will be unable to send. So that's the end of that section. I'm going to just jump into here. So thank you so much for Stuart Feedback Andrews from Cinephobia Radio for listening. You should go and check out Cinephobia Radio. Stuart Feedback Andrews' work is fantastic. I've been listening to him since he was on Rue Morgue Radio maybe 2 decades ago. I can't remember when, but he's a fantastic broadcaster, one of the best people, I think, in the broadcast space. Thank you so much to Foxy Joe for the super sticker. I can't say how much I appreciate it. And Horace Smith asks the question, would the rise of social media be expected to lead to even more uniformly depictions of UFOs and aliens? That's a very good question, Horace. Maybe that's something I need to deal with in the book some as well. So I appreciate that feedback very, very much. Now let's jump into a section, as you'll see why it's called this in a minute. I called it, just the working thing anyway, is called It's Evil Demons from the Republic of the Matrix All the Way Down. One common thread weaving its subversive way through the history of ideas presents us with another model. It suggests that reality is not what or how we perceive it to be. Our existence may be illusory or inconsequential. What we experience in our day-to-day lives may be subservient to a higher order to which we are oblivious, or we might just misinterpret existence with our flawed perceptual tools. One of the earliest and best-known iterations of this strain of thought appears in the writings of Plato. Now, he posited that the physical phenomena of this world were imperfect imitations of ideal ones. Now, I do have a little, you're going to have to give me a second. I'll try to pop it up if I can. I do here have somewhere a little picture of what I'm about to talk about. I had a lot of pictures, but it's going to slow me down if I start talking about it. I put it up for you now. Now, what Plato posited was that there was a physical phenomenon, this word was imperfect imitations of ideal ones. So objects that we experience, be them dogs or chairs or men, are like distorted reflections glimpsed in 1,000 shards of a shattered mirror. All of them are flawed representations of an ideal form or idea. Plato's best known presentation of this is the allegory of the cave, found in his most influential work, The Republic. And every student who has ever taken a Philosophy 101 course has had this allegory pummeled into their heads. And it's so ubiquitous that herein we'll just present a very brief overview. So Plato imagined a scenario where prisoners spent their entire lives confined in a cave. Therein, they were chained to face a wall. All they could see was shadows from a kind of puppet show engineered before them, falling onto the wall's rocky surface. Those shadows were the captive's reality, or at least their only sense of the world. Indeed, Plato imagined that a prisoner from such a scenario would become so acclimated to the cave that he would have to be dragged kicking and screaming into the blinding and terrifying sunlit reality above. And should the prisoner ever return to the dark cavern, he would appear blind and insane to his fellow prisoners. They, in turn, would then resist ever leaving the familiar faux reality of their subterranean prison. Now, drawing on Plato's theory of forms, the more overtly religious Neoplatonist movement developed. And like contemporaneous Gnostic Christian traditions, indeed they often borrowed from each other, Neoplatonism conceptualized our world as an inherently flawed physical descent from higher and realer divine forms. A thorough discussion of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism is well beyond the scope of tonight's conversation, but from Plato onwards, this strain became a potent alternative in the history of religious and philosophical thought. We see it in the physical spiritual dualism of 3rd century Manichaeism, in the Cathar heresy of the Middle Ages, and again in 17th century French philosopher René Descartes' famous contemplation of a malicious demon or evil genius, powerful enough to trap us in a delusion where nothing was real but our own consciousness. Hence, I think, therefore I am, the phrase you're all probably familiar with. In the 1970s, this same idea manifested in thought experiments, which posited that you might just be a brain in a vat or laying in a laboratory with wires running into your head from a large computer, fooling you into thinking you existed in an external reality. Today, the idea manifests in the talking point that we all might exist in a matrix-style computer simulation. Such discussions can reach ad infinitum ridiculousness and illustrate what is known as the problem of infinite regress, asserting that we might be nowhere near base reality. Some thinkers, including billionaire tech mogul Elon Musk, posit that due to the advances we have seen in computer game technology over the past 40 years and projecting such advances into the near future, where our virtual reality experiences in said games will become indistinguishable from reality, we most likely already exist inside a computer-generated simulation, inside a computer-generated simulation, inside a computer-generated simulation, and so on. Now, such thinking is reminiscent of an anecdote involving the Hindi myth that the planet Earth is supported on the back of a giant world turtle. And this might be an apocryphal tale, but it's worth telling. The influential 19th century psychologist William James was presented with the world turtle cosmology by an audience member following one of his famous lectures. This little old lady came up to him and told him about the world turtle story. And so James asked her, "What does the turtle stand on?" And she replied, "A second, far larger turtle." And then James responded with the obvious follow-up question, "And what does this second turtle stand on?" To which this elderly zealot replied, "It's turtles all the way down." how well, somebody's warning me. Apparently, people are telling me that my sound is off and my audio is gone. Oh my goodness. I don't know how that happened because I certainly didn't touch any buttons. I wonder how long ago my sound went off. Can anybody remember what the last thing I said was? I might have to go through it again. Let me see very quickly. This is the danger of looking at uh it's turtles all the way down. Thank you so much from Cinemaphobia Radio. Okay, so that means I have to rewind a little bit. Thank you so much for the messaging, and I'll be able to edit this in post for the audio. So I really do appreciate it. So we're up to turtles all the way down. Thank you so much, Stuart, and for everybody else, Bob and Ed, and everybody who was trying to message me. I just thought it was people pinging my Facebook, and I was ignoring it. So just let me go back to where we're up to, and thank you so much for bearing with me while I go back to it being turtles all the way down. Okay, it's turtles all the way down. Okay, so, but let's not throw out the concept because of its potential to carry us towards fallaciousness. Plenty of ideas are loaded with similar dangers. Now, in his groundbreaking 1979 book, Messengers of Deception, Jacques Vallée introduced a potent allegory reminiscent of Plato's cave. He suggested that UFO encounters are akin to the experience of watching a film in a cinema. While staring at the bright display projected onto the screen in front of them, audience members are oblivious to the real technology generating the imagery. That mechanism is located in the darkness behind them, perched out of sight in the projection booth. Moreover, while the images and story projected onto the screen appear very different depending upon what movie one goes to see, the technology generating the imagery remains the same. Likewise, varying UFO experiences and all kinds of paranormal experiences for that matter, while appearing different on the surface, may also originate from one root source. The projector in Vallée's model is part of a control system. Vallée imagines said system operating like a thermostat, but instead of switching on and off to regulate temperature, it might project intermittent UFO imagery to somehow regulate human consciousness. So doing, it engineers our beliefs and therefore society itself. Vallée stated that he had not determined whether the control system is, and this is a quote from Vallée, natural or spontaneous, whether it is explainable in terms of genetics, of social psychology, or of ordinary phenomenon, or if it is artificial in nature and under the power of some superhuman will. It may be entirely determined by laws that we have not yet discovered. The suggestion that UFOs are part of a control system might be a literal truth beyond even what Vallée intended. He followed the above suggestion just a few pages later by qualifying, and he said, "When I speak of a control system for planet Earth, I do not want my words to be misunderstood. I do not mean that some higher order of beings has us locked inside the constraints of a space-bound jail, closely monitored by psychic entities we might call angels or demons. I do not propose to redefine God. What I do mean is that mythology rules at a level of our social reality over which normal political and intellectual action has no real power." Now, contra Vallée, I'd argue that the undeniable potency of mythology and the existence of a higher order of intelligent beings with the power to keep us bound in this reality are not concepts which require mutual exclusivity. Some intelligence operating from outside the existence we inhabit may be throwing controlled disruptors into our realm, some of which may appear as UFO phenomena. Perhaps, as Vallée suggested, this is to engineer or regulate belief. Or perhaps they are designed to fulfill some deep-seated need our species has for mystery, but never give us the answer, much like fairy dust in fairy lore. Somebody goes into a fairy palace and comes back with some fairy gold as proof of their experience, but poof, when they're in daylight, the fairy gold evaporates. This always seems to evaporate as well whenever a witness or experiencer comes back with a story. So perhaps these anomalies interjected into our system distract us from looking too closely at the structure of the system itself. They are presented as recognizable archetypal, mythological, or cultural tropes. Diminutive aliens and flying saucers, Blessed Virgin Marys, relict ape men, sea serpents, the ghost of great Aunt Gertrude, and so on, all of them waving a promissory note of paradigm-shifting enlightenment, but none of them ever getting close enough for us to snatch that fabled chit from their ever-morphing appendages. These projections radiate a mysterious and mesmerizing allure, just strange and frequent enough in their manifestations to impact human imagination and myth, yet not so incomprehensible or so regular to cause us to throw off broader beliefs about the nature of reality itself. Or it could be that an external intelligence is intentionally messing with the system, sending in data points designed to conflict with our reality. And perhaps that's to get our attention. Perhaps it's difficult to determine if this interjection or injection is good or bad. It's like a shot from a doctor or a shot from an experimenter. It could be acting with benevolent, malevolent, or to the human mind, unknowable motives. And if we are indeed trapped in such a system, one situated below a higher existence, it would explain why flying saucers, along with other mythic manifestations interjected into our reality from outside the system, don't abide by those physical laws that constrain the rest of the beings and objects residing within. Think of the hypothetical external intelligence like a computer game designer. The cheat code or God mode or Easter eggs they embed in the program are not bound by the standard constraints of the simulation. So aliens pass through walls, as do ghosts. Bigfoot, like religious apparitions, can disappear in a flash. None of them seem to abide by the physical laws that constrain the rest of the planet's inhabitants. And after they pass through our reality, leave nothing but the occasional footprint or landing pod mark or a blurry photo. They never seem to leave any type of conclusive physical evidence. Now, the obvious throwaway line here about UFOs and other anomalous phenomena are that they are a glitch in the matrix. And this confers the concept that it's most simplistic, I think, because culturally we understand that a fake non-baseline reality is the Matrix because of the popular film series of the same name. That trilogy portrayed, in fact, there's more, there are 4 films now. I only saw the first 3. That trilogy portrayed, or quadrology, what is it? Portrayed a future dystopia where human beings are physically trapped in coffin-sized pods and their comatose bodies are harvested for energy, while their brains are plugged in a virtual reality simulation of the late 20th century world. But the film's creators, the Wachowski brothers, now the Wachowski sisters, only homogenized ideas from the long-standing intellectual traditions we've already talked about, from Plato through Descartes to brain in a vat thought experiments. Upon the release of The Matrix, a friend of mine in Sydney, which is where I lived when those films came out, dismissively stated it's PK Dick for dummies. And while he was flippant, he was also right. So to understand PK Dick's part in all of this, we have to go back to a day in the 1970s when Philip K. Dick, arguably the most influential science fiction writer of the 20th century, who, films like Blade Runner come from his work, for example, he just had a wisdom tooth removed and he'd ordered a painkiller from the pharmacy, I believe. And when he answered the front door, when the pharmacist came to deliver it, it was a young woman who was wearing a necklace with that old Christian fish symbol hanging off it as a pendant. And Dick says that a pink beam of light shot out of that pendant and hit him right between his eyes in his forehead. And suddenly he was aware that the reality of 1970s America was just imprinted upon a deeper, older reality. Beneath the modern veneer, he could see ancient Rome. He realized he was simultaneously both Philip K. Dick and a Gnostic Christian living in that period in ancient Rome. As he famously stated in a number of oft-repeated lines in his semi-autobiographical novel, Valis, he said, "The empire never ended, and we were all living in a black-iron prison." I'm about to explain what all that means. The title of the novel, Valis, is an acronym for Vast, Active, Living, Intelligent System. Elsewhere in his writings, notably in his non-fiction exegesis, Dick alternatively called this non-human intelligence zebra. And within his novels, Valis or Zebra appears variously as an extraterrestrial satellite circling the Earth while beaming messages to enlighten the elect, a Russian psyop, and a manifestation of God. In his exegesis, Dick describes Zebra as a living, sentient plasma. It entered our reality to free us from Dick's Gnostic concept of the black iron prison, which he abbreviated as BIP or BIP. In the following passage, we see a large part of where the idea for the Matrix probably clearly originated. And so this message from Dick's exegesis, it kind of is that dumbed down. I mean, this shows that the Matrix kind of is a dumbed down version, at least according to my friend who was very familiar with both Dick and those films. So Dick said, "We are not enslaved by a false world because there is no world there. We are enslaved by a real and evil entity which projects data contoured to resemble a world. It is a thing, the BIP or black iron prism. It fires controlling stimuli, signals at us, which we are compelled to respond to in fixed ways. If we could see this structure as it really is, we would see ourselves in the midst of disinhibiting stimuli fired at us so as to link up with internal synchronized up to then inhibited circuits. We would see no world, but we would see a vast structure, virtually a big black iron building, totally enclosing us, just firing signals again and again at us. We must serve some purpose to it, but who cares what that is? It is sufficient to know that it isn't to our advantage and we need rescue. Maybe we're sources of energy to it, we help power it, but more likely it is a gestalt, bogus, and imitation of the legitimate universe organism. Now, while you might be asking, what does this have to do with UFOs? I'm about to get to that. Dick's ideas can be traced to that Neoplatonic Gnostic movements that we looked at earlier, and of particular significance to our discussion about UFOs. Dick understood that tales from these earlier traditions, like his concept of an amorphous zebra or Valis, resemble, these are Dick's words, the will-o'-the-wisp UFO sightings and contacts. And zebra has a little of that playful, mirthful quality, very much so. Look, I am here, no there. Look, I am this, no that, e.g. from the past or the future or another planet or an alternative universe. Riddles and pranks. We are being charmed and beguiled and entranced. And by this process, our fear of the unknown abates, and also we become enthralled children, absolutely fascinated by the emerging pattern of what we see. Continually, we are given the option of dismissing what we are shown by the master magician prankster. That's what Dick said. So the Matrix might not be a bunch of comatose people plugged or downloaded into a sinister AI program. It might be a physical disconnect from a deeper spiritual truth, a snare which separates us from a higher divine existence. And those mythic structures, including UFOs that apport into our profane reality, might be sent from a benevolent higher intelligence, the same intelligence which P.K. Dick labeled Valis. Their purpose is to help us see the ridiculousness and contradictions of the prison that confines us, and by illuminating these flaws, wake us up. Or maybe not. UFO researcher and occultist Alan Greenfield offers a very different take on Valis in his occult classic Secret Cipher of the UFOnauts. Greenfield equates Valis with the Gnostic demiurge, an evil creator that has trapped mankind in an inferior physical world, separating us from higher divine reality. Valis keeps, according to Greenfield, humanity in a state of materialist trance and evolutionary stagnation. Now, this inverts Dick's interpretation of a benevolent and messianic sentient plasma. If Greenfield is correct, then the earlier suggestion that we talked about earlier tonight, that UFOs and their anomalous cohorts are generated to keep us psychically placated, that may be accurate. These manifestations become the mythic equivalent of an opioid sedative, leading our mind and spirit along phantasmagorical flights of fantasy, rather than leaving us sober enough to contemplate and perhaps discover genuine spiritual truth. Of course, all we have is a hypothetical perspective to determine whether such a disruptive gatekeeper is good or evil. But whatever the intention of Valis and whatever the purpose of the sources, recognizing that they are related to our confinement in the black iron prison might present a clue to how we can unlock our cosmic cage. As the famous mystic Georges Gurdjieff often proclaimed, if a man in prison was at any time to have a chance of escape, then he must first of all realize that he is in prison. So long as he fails to realize this, so long as he thinks that he is free, he has no chance whatever. So thank you so much again for everybody getting me back on track. I was just checking to see if there are any more questions or comments. I can't thank you all enough. I hope you're enjoying this little presentation. And now I move on. Actually, let me just double check again in case I didn't scroll down far enough for any questions. And thank you to the other people who have dropped in to say hello as well. So this is a little piece I called Not of the Race of Adam, which is based on a fairy story, which I won't actually go into tonight in the presentation because it would take me too long, but it was something that was said by a fairy in Scotland. So anyone with more than an interest in fairy lore and the UFO phenomenon can't help but see clear parallels between the two. This realization led Jacques Vallée to pen his paradigm-blasting Passport to Magonia in 1969, part iconoclastic loogie aimed at the scientific establishment in the wake of the biased Condon Report, and part revelatory brainstorm. And it's difficult to pick up a book by any real thinker on the phenomenon since then and not see the comparison made between fairy faith and UFO lore. So whether it's Jerome Clark and Lauren Coleman's The Unidentified, Joshua Cutchin's Thieves in the Night, Ted Holliday and Colin Wilson's The Goblin Universe, John Keel's UFO Operation Trojan Horse, Jim Brandon's The Rebirth of Pan, Keith Thompson's Aliens and Angels, as well as various academics like Thomas Bullard has looked at it. And I only mention all of those names to make the point that I'm not inventing what I'm about to tell you now. This has been something people have been talking about since the 60s. And even I found recently Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver were talking about it as early as the 1950s. So it's a long tradition of thought within the UFO community realizing the parallels between UFO lore and fairy faith. But let's examine that a little bit. So unfortunately, though, many in the UFO community, including some of its most influential players, have seemed oblivious to such parallels. The documentarian Carol Rainey, the ex-wife of the late Bud Hopkins, pointed out that her ex-husband, along with his colleagues in the alien abduction research community, and for those of you who don't know, Bud Hopkins is arguably the most important writer and player in that space. He's passed now, but he dominated the scene from the 80s through the 90s. So Rainey said that her ex-husband, Bud Hopkins, and his colleagues had almost zero understanding of historical antecedents and folkloric similarities to the modern alien abduction phenomenon. I can confirm this myself when I had my own encounter and conversation with Bud Hopkins at Fort Fest in 99. Now, he was a friendly man and I enjoyed talking to him, but he did, I believe his speech was on the similarities between witch marks or on the bodies of witches and or at least he brought it up in his speech, I think, and alien abductees having marks. Or maybe he just brought up the alien abductees having marks, now I think about it. And I brought up to him at a breakfast we had together, don't you think there's a parallel between these witch marks and alien abductees having marks on their bodies? And he was very, very dismissive, as friendly as he was. He was very dismissive at this moment. He said, all of this comparison with fairy stuff is just bunk. There's no pots of golds at the end of alien abduction stories. Well, anybody familiar with fairy faith knows there's hardly ever a pot of gold at the end of a fairy story either. This is something we're used to from Lucky Charm, commercials and maybe a couple of stories about leprechauns. That isn't a standard trope of fairy faith. So he just used that dismissively to shut down, fallaciously, to shut down, I think, a genuine point. There are significant similarities between older folkloric traditions and UFO belief. So the flip side to this willful ignorance can manifest in another unhelpful way, though. When discovering parallels between UFO phenomena and previous traditions, many ufologists telescope their own modern beliefs onto the past. So they presume with embarrassing confidence and distasteful ethnocentrism that previous cultures misinterpreted visiting extraterrestrials as fairies and gods or angels and demons. So they say older indigenous mythologies that mention sky gods or supernatural beings descending from the heavens, that they're definitely ETs. Those ones seem to excite the ufologists the most. You could almost hear their smugness when they realized this similarity. Our primitive ancestors were so ignorant that they mistook space aliens as gods. Those of us living in the modern space age and plugged into science fiction aren't bridled by such silly, culturally bound biases and presumptions. We know those ancient visitors were really interstellar astronauts in flying saucers. Now, I'm being facetious, but that's not too far removed. And there are indeed myths of supernatural entities descending from the heavens, but there are even more tales involving non-human humanoids living here on Earth. These beings can reside on high mountaintops or in deep caverns. Often they live in or below ancient ruins and hills. Some call the oceans, seas, lakes, or rivers their home. Others are said to inhabit lonely forests and hidden grottos. And most often, they visit us from a place just separated from our veil by a thin veil. All of these were chronicled in fairy faith. And to say encounters with such entities were frequent would be disingenuous, but they were regular enough that people who hadn't had their own personal experience knew of someone who had. Indeed, fairy reports still continued, perhaps with slightly less regularity, well into modernity, and in some places even up to the present day. Notably in places where folk belief in such beings was so strong that it survived up until the current day. Now, those raised in such traditions have always understood the fairies or the other crowd or whatever they would call them in a far more immediate and comprehensive way than we understand alleged extraterrestrial visitors today. The fairies weren't just the stuff of pop culture and fringe belief. They were once part of daily existence and consensus reality. Protocols existed regarding how to behave should one encounter them. Just as my parents taught me how to deal with predatory strangers, don't believe what they tell you and run in the opposite direction screaming for help, which I did, thankfully, previous generations were instructed on how to avoid, or worst case scenario, deal with meeting a member of the other crowd. Travelling after dark, particularly on certain dates, was a bad idea. So the Gaelic quarter days, and Imbolc, Beltane, I'm probably mispronouncing this, Logdashar and Samhain, were when the Sidhe journeyed between their habitations. So travel on those nights was best avoided, as were places all through the year associated with the fairies, be them fairy rings, forts, trees, or other fairyish locales. One never wanted to catch the fairies unaware, or more to the point, be caught by the fairies while spying upon them. The fair folk valued their privacy and would punish humans who infringed upon it. This included people who had secret interactions with the fairies, but loose leaps following such dealings. I kind of joke here, but if only such courtesies were known today, we probably would never almost ever hear about, some of these UFO reports. There certainly wouldn't be people, wanting to publicize their stories quite so much. Now, the fair folk were quick to anger, so one had to be careful and polite in any dealings with them. This caution extended to even speaking about them. Better not to, but if one must, best to refer to them with benevolent and gracious sounding titles, like the gentry or the good people. One should never accept any food or drink, which they offered. Indeed, if someone did consume refreshments while in fairyland, he may never be able to return to the land of mortal men. Although the above point about politeness also needed to be remembered, so one had to be very careful with how one handled such refusals. Fairies were unable to cross flowing water, and we're running out of time because I spoke too much, but it goes on and on and on. There was everything from carrying black-handled daggers to hanging scissors above a baby's cradle to using certain plants were ways to protect yourself from the fair folk. So it was entrenched in the culture of the day. Now, so let's move on to what I think is a key point, and that's about fairy glamour and how fairy faith taught its adherents to doubt what they experienced while undergoing a fairy encounter. Now, glamour was a kind of hypnotism which affects the senses of the beholder, a mesmerism or enchantment, so that things were perceived or not perceived as the enchanter wished. So intrinsic is this power to the nature of the fairies that their very name came to reflect it. In her essential and encyclopedia of fairies, Catherine Biggs summarizes, Fae was the earliest form in which the word fairy appears. It is generally supposed to be a broken down version of fatae, the fates, which in Romance tradition became less formidable and multiplied in number. The word fairy was originally fairy, the enchantment of the fays, and only later became applied to the people working the enchantment rather than the state of the illusion. The actual word glamour, thought to be power, also belonging to witches, derives from the same semantic root as grammar, and this is a bit of an aside, but it's worth knowing. It probably originates from the idea that the ability to enchant came from a magical incantation written in and read from an occult manuscript or a book of spells, although when used in reference to the fair folk, it implied a power innate to their race, not something book-learnt. But rather than focusing on the sometimes diminutive size of both aliens and fairies, along with similarities between alien abduction and fairy kidnap narratives like reproductive agendas and missing time, it is this overlooked ability of the other crowd or the fairies, their power to beguile our senses, that should have been the focus, I think, of comparative UFO research. If an entire antecedent mythology based the very name of its non-human denizens on their ability to enchant and deceive us mortal folk, then common sense suggests we should have adjusted our focus accordingly. In his posthumously published The Crypto-Terrestrials, the late Mac Tonnies hypothesized that the UFO entities abducting humans were a hidden Earth-based species rather than extraterrestrials hailing from a distant star system. Years earlier, in his examination of alien contact phenomena, the late great occult writer Colin Wilson had presented similar musings. He said, perhaps some semi-supernatural beings with whom we unknowingly share the earth have been abducting humans since the beginning of history. The idea of a secretive humanoid race living parallel to us is, of course, central to fairy lore. In other words, it's Ireland's Tuatha De Danann. Many say that Ireland's fairies are actually this earlier race, forced underground when the Gaelic people arrived from what is now Spain, either in defeat or through an impasse. The Tuatha De Danann retreated and took occupancy of the subterranean hidden world. The new human invaders remained in the sunlit reality above. Some anthropologists have suggested that this mythology might be based on the genuine defeat of a Stone Age Aboriginal race native to the island who were forced into hiding by Iron Age invaders. Similarly, Iceland's Huldafolk, the hidden people, a name which is almost a direct translation of Tonni's term crypto-terrestrials, are also said to live alongside, but usually out of sight, of the island's above-ground residents, as do that nation's elves, who are sometimes distinguished from the Huldafolk as appearing less human or sometimes taken as being the same. The Huldafolk, like Ireland's fairies, are known to kidnap and interbreed with humans. There is a psychological and intellectual comfort in recognizing the similarities between aliens and their fairy antecedents. There's also safety there, so recognizing the similarities makes us feel like we have paid attention to the phenomenon and placed it into a longer and broader mythological tradition. But it also kind of lets us move on. So, okay, mystery solved, but of course, just recognizing the similarities, no matter how deft such comparative analysis may be, actually solves nothing. So for the next few minutes, join me in discarding the comparative folklore safety net, and following Tonni's lead, let's extend our analysis beyond the now trite proclamation that contemporary aliens are just a psychological reimagining of the fairies in space-age garb. Instead, consider that people encountering alien humanoids today may be interacting with the other crowd, the fairies of old, unawares. And I mean this here, in this thought experiment, in a literal sense. These beings still startling us in deep woods and lonely fields, dark back roads, and our bedsides are the same supernatural race chronicled in folklore. They have been interacting with our species since prehistory, and contrary to the assertions of ancient alien theorists and other UFO believers, it wasn't our ancestors blinded by cultural bias who mistook ETs as supernatural beings. No, our forefathers had a far deeper, more comprehensive and immediate understanding of these beings than those of us raised in modernity and beyond. So to suggest that our ancestors were somehow more ignorant than we are when it came to such dealings is ridiculous. Instead, UFO witnesses from the latter 20th century onwards, mesmerized by science fiction popularizations of alien visitors, transposed their space-age beliefs onto a much older but still present reality. And perhaps the fairies themselves were happy to reshape the workings of their glamour in accordance with modern man's techno-sci-fi predilections. And according to Tonnies, modern experiences may have been helped in their delusions by the crypto-terrestrials themselves. He cites examples of UFO abductees seeing what look like discarded costumes, implying that the aliens were hurried to complete some theatrical demonstration for the experiencer, one designed to mislead the human subject to their alleged extraterrestrial origins. Perhaps that might be the case, but remember the fairies' power of glamour. While not discarding Tonni's point, to which we will return in a minute, if we are still dealing with the fair folk, the lack of physical tells to their illusions is meaningless. We are talking about a supernatural species who were defined by, indeed named from, their very ability to mess with our senses. Strieber himself has often wondered if the visitors may not be the fair folk of old. Maybe there really is another species living upon the earth, he mused in Communion, A True Story, which was his debut on the alien abduction scene. And he wrote, the fairies, the gnomes, the sliffs, the vampires, goblins, who attach to reality along a different line than we do, but who know and love us as we do the wild things of the woods. of related interest, but perhaps a dead end, and certainly one that I don't believe has ever been pursued. In Transformation, Strieber's follow-up book, he references a then unpublished paper, which apparently remains unpublished to this day, at least I can't find it, written by one Leonard Keane, called Celtic Factor Red. I'd say Celtic Factor Red, but it's the Celtic spelt with a K. So it's Celtic or Celtic Factor Red, allegedly demonstrated that not only that large numbers of visitor encounters were reported by people of Celtic background, but determined the language and names of the aliens in such high-profile abductions as the Betty Andreasson account were iterations of Gaelic. Of course, this tantalizing implication, at least for me, is that the visitors are the fairies. After all, what culture is more associated with fairy faith than the Gaelic? When we start to suspect that the aliens of today are the fairies of old, our social conditioning makes it difficult not to slide towards positivist explanations. As creatures of modernity and postmodernity, we almost can't help but literalize, and by that I mean physicalize this realization. We seem unable to imagine that the fairies/aliens, if real, are not bound by the same physical laws that constrain us. Indeed, even for Tawnies, this seems inescapable, hence the need to find physical hints and proof of how the crypto-terrestrials engineered their deceit. So he talks about props built like flying saucers and discarded costumes and the like. But Tiny's literalization and physicalization was mild compared to some others. While asserting this fairy origin of modern ETs, many can't help but slide towards ancient astronaut theory. So the Tuatha De Danann, while a genuine prehistoric race, must have been of extraterrestrial origin, according to some. For example, according to Lars Bergen, who I believe is a pen name for Sharon De La Rose in the book Nordic Aliens and the Fairies of Ireland, the fairies are likely the ancestors of the Nordic aliens, who in contact belief are still visiting Earth today. Their powers were technologically based. And Bergen or Delarose writes, the Tuatha De Danann utilized technology which included flying machines, self-navigating speedboats with voice recognition and GPS systems, revolving castles, cloaking technology, personal invisibility, human cloning, memory manipulation, and so on and so on and so on. And this idea that Tuatha De Danann, the fairies, were actually technologically astute, and that's what gave them the powers. Now, ignoring the key tenet of fairy faith, that much of what the good people show us, including their fabulous abodes, is just an illusion. Delarose added they lived in addition to subterranean palaces, the gentry lived in self-lit castles on land, some of which could revolve or were suspended in the air, and they also lived under water, yada, yada, yada. So the point is, traditional fairy faith understood that this presentation of grand castles was just glamour, while people today can't help but take that literally, and they have to almost physicalize it and make it like there were science fiction tropes that existed back then. We'll move on to another ultra-terrestrial fairy type theorist now. And in his recent paper on ultra-terrestrial models, H.E. Puthoff posits a similar hypothesis, if in more sober terms. And I would suggest that some of Puthoff's hypothesis really is worth considering. You can find it online if you just Google ultra-terrestrial models, H.E. Puthoff. Taking the term ultra-terrestrial, first introduced by Ivan Sanderson and later popularized by John Keel, Puthoff establishes a new definition. Keel never intended the title to refer to literal beings as some type of alternative to extraterrestrials, but rather as a literary device. And many have ignored Keel's point on this. But Puthoff instead uses it in a very literal sense to refer to one or more of the following. And this is what he describes ultra-terrestrials as possibly being an ancient occult group, an isolated pre-diluvial high-tech society, i.e. the Shaver mystery, which we'll get to in a minute, stranded ETs or gods, sequestered terrestrial cultures existing alongside us in distinct stealth. While some of this is worth considering, it extends beyond the frame of our immediate focus on the fair folk. Puthoff's model, like Delarose's, imagines the cryptoterrestrials as technologically advanced, if now Earth-based extraterrestrials or something similar. This shares much with ancient astronaut theory and the type of ideas posited by Richard Shaver and Raymond Palmer in the mid-1940s, which again is the documentary I'm making at the moment. Go to theshavermystery.com and go on like the Facebook page that will take you to. Thank you. And so they were talking about a pre-diluvial spacefaring civilization as well, still existing on Earth in hidden subterranean caverns. And all such ideas take the literal approach that crypto-terrestrials are not supernatural, even if our ancestors whose interactions with them were far more regular than ours are, and they identified them as so. Rather, our hidden neighbors today are reimagined as futuristic peoples or extraterrestrials, and all of the magic, the glamour, and wonder of these beings is discarded to be replaced by science fictionalization of their powers. Eddie Lenihan, who I adore, and he's perhaps the world's greatest living folklorist and certainly its greatest living collator collector and teller of modern fairy accounts, lamented that traditional fairy faith and perhaps the experiences themselves were likely to be subsumed in just such a way as they have been. He wrote, "I'm sure that it cannot survive under the immense pressures and distractions of modern Irish life." And he's talking about fairy faith now. "Under a different guise, maybe, but not as fairy belief. And what a tragedy that will be, for if the modern need for things above and beyond the mundane, the merely explainable by science or whatever, is to continue to thrive, as no doubt it will, how much more fitting that should be part of Irish culture, one that is immeasurably old and instinctively recognizable, rather than as a belief in aliens or extraterrestrials merely from other parts of our galaxy or beyond." Now, fairy lore has often posited the gentry as belonging to an earlier era, and according to such wisdom, the fairies are really rarely seen in current times. And current times are going back to stories being told in the 19th century. That was current times then. But truth be told, our good neighbors never left us. They never will. In those places where remnants of older folk belief linger, people still encounter them, beings yet unchanged by the ever-encroaching demystification of modernity. Yet what are those sad regions where inhabitants no longer believe? Places where once potent folk memories regarding a coexistent supernatural race are now dismissed as folly, or worse yet, forgotten. Well, let's be honest. That's most of the Western world. And in these amnesiac landscapes, Eddie's warnings for Ireland have long since come to pass. But the fair folk still appear to us, only in a guise which matches our modern expectations, egged on by science fictional imaginings, ancient astronaut literalizations, and ufology's pale offerings. They now work their glamour to weave space-age delusions. You can almost hear their mischievous voices, still refusing to be ignored. You expect us to appear as space aliens and flying saucers? Okay, then space aliens and flying saucers is what you'll get. But whatever deceptions they weave, whatever visage they don, our good neighbors allow one truth to resonate down through the centuries. We are not the race of Adam. Now, let me just quickly check if anybody is here. Thank you for everybody who's popping in. Horace kindly says, "Dean, you definitely need to finish his book. Few, if any others, can bring to the subject your breadth and depth of knowledge combined with long thinking." Well, thank you so much for that, Horace. Ed Schultz asks, who is a regular guest on the show and was once known as a psychic priest and is also a very skilled hypnotherapist, asks, what place do dreams have in all of this? That's a very good question, Ed, and something I deal with a little more elsewhere, and something I will consult with you on because I know you're quite conscious of that. Flat Rockland says, "Just got here, great topic, Dean." And Asper60, who is Jay Katz, or Aspersia, his lovely wife, who they do the show on the Untold Radio Network, which you are watching or listening to this on now, Down South Anomalies, which is fantastic. He says, "Running late, catch later, respect to all, happy new year. May it be safe and profound." And he said, "Thomas Eddie Bullard, The Myth and Mysteries of UFOs." I mentioned Bullard before. And he says, "Dean, thank you. So it's wonderful to have you there." I normally kill it within an hour, but because I stuffed up before when my sound was off for a little bit, I am going to continue. I'm going to have to cut it a little bit shorter, though, anyway. And the next part of my presentation is called Dead Men Tell Tall Tales. And the famous Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg wrote, "When spirits begin to speak with a man, he must be aware that he believed nothing that they say, for nearly everything they say is fabricated by them. And they lie. For if they are permitted to narrate anything as what heaven is and how things in the heavens are to be understood, they would tell so many lies that a man would be astonished." So again, mystics for a long time and commentators for a long time have been conscious of the type of deceit which we're talking about tonight, of things presenting themselves not as they are and saying things that aren't necessarily true. This and I can't go through it all, but this section is about, obviously, Dead Men Tell Tales, the connection between death and the UFO phenomenon. And again, famous abductee and author Whitley Strieber and his wife Anne Strieber both came to the conclusion that the alien abduction phenomenon and the visitors had something to do with death. Similarly, psychologist and near-death experience expert Kenneth Ring wrote extensively about the commonalities between the abduction experience and near-death experience. And I would suggest anybody who's interested in this aspect, which we don't have time to touch on really tonight, I'd suggest looking at Joshua Cutchin's excellent Ecology of Souls, where he looks at not just UFOs in connection with death and the death experience and the afterlife, but also paranormal phenomena in general. It's a fantastic book, and while I touch on a lot of those things in this chapter, I think Cutchin's book will remain the high points in analysis and academia and thinking on this topic. Now, I'm going to briefly hit on one last part, and then I might have to wind up. And this is a part I call No Truth in Them. So we are dealing, when we're talking about the UFO phenomenon, with something that appears in the blink of an eye and disappears just as quickly. It wakes us from our sleep. It can terrify, it can mesmerize. It can appear as nightmarish goblins or angelic space brothers. It can appear as our own dead. It can be visible or invisible. It tricks our senses like the Fae. It tells us half-truths or universal truisms like a cold reader or a back-alley psychic, knowing just what to whisper to convince the susceptible of its omniscience. Sometimes, like the devil himself, the lies it tells are outright falsehoods, but packaged in clever ways that appeal to our weaknesses and vanities, messages that flatter, persuade, and then convince. When the UFO phenomenon, or more to the point, UFO occupants, the alleged ETs, posit any type of philosophy or religion, it reflects New Age beliefs that wind their way back through theosophical posturings and other religious traditions that are hostile to traditional Christianity and Judaism and biblically centered doctrine. It's probably worth reiterating that the phenomenon itself hurts people, injures people, rapes people, and sometimes kills people. So it's difficult not to use the term demonic when describing large swathes of alien abduction reports. And something very strange is going on in the relationships that develop between some of these beings and the people who encounter them. Many abductees downplay or ignore physical harm perpetrated against them. And as we will see, some contactees follow commands sent to them by the ETs, even to their own death. Others, like famed abductee Whitley Strieber, and I have to be careful how I say this because it's a family-friendly show, so let's just say he was interfered with so violently by his visitors and in such a horrendous manner that in his 60s, decades after that experience took place, he still complains in his writings about the physical scarring he was left with. But yet still somehow Strieber manages to assure his readers that this was all somehow for his own enlightenment. And it seems to me, at least, he, like many others, have submerged good sense beneath a weird and heady blend of Stockholm syndrome and sometimes self-appointed, or perhaps that should be self-anointed, shamanism. And others, like 1960 contactee channeler and cult leader Gloria B., who was the wife of aircraft designer William H. Byrd, literally starved herself to death by following instructions given to her by her mentor from Jupiter. No matter, though, another contactee cult soon started channeling her spirit and claimed she was happy and living on the other side. 20-odd years later, Laverne Landis, a mother of 5, froze to death waiting for the Space Brothers. As instructed to her by her telepathic ET overlords, she sat in a car near Moon Lake, Minnesota, in a month-long vigil before finally succumbing to sub-zero temperatures. Needless to say, the benevolent aliens never arrived. Her dehydrated, starved, and half-frozen companion, Gerald Flack, escaped the same fate by crawling a quarter-mile through freezing snow. John Keel noted how destructive such contacts could be for those who underwent them. Strieber, along with other experiences running the gamut from contactees and abductees, have often been dismissed as manipulative charlatans or deluded simpletons or a mix of the two. But maybe it's they who've been manipulated. Regardless, since that November evening in 1952, when George Adamski ignored biblical prescriptions, and the biblical prescription, of course, and Keel talks about this, who wasn't a Christian, is Matthew 24:26. And it says, wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. So don't go into the desert to meet messiahs, basically. But anyway, again, it's a point Keel brought up. And when George Adamski ignored this biblical prescription and wandered into the California desert to commune with his space messiahs, the narratives he returned with have rightly been questioned, particularly Adamski when he started to sell books, and other contactees who started to sell books or begin New Age religions and seemingly profiteered from said experiences. But again, I suspect the root of some of this might have been a genuine experience. They might have been deceived themselves. And one such example is Edward Billy Meyer, the one-armed Swiss contactee. He founded a religion based on his contact with the Plejarians, also known as the Pleiadians, and is often referred to in the UFO parlance as the Nordics. Meyer's alien friends, true to the mold dating back to Adamski, through Theosophy's Ascended Masters, the biblical descriptions of fallen angels of light appear as beautiful ethereal beings with skin so pale and so perfect it approach luminescence. Their mission is to guide Earth in its spiritual evolution, in direct opposition to Earth-based religions and the detrimental effect they have had on the development of the human spirit. Meyer is perhaps best known for his rather stunning photographs, which I think probably hoaxes, of flying saucers, or beam ships as they are allegedly called. According to Meyer, the primary Plejarian contact is an entity named Semjaze. Another contactee, the American Fred Bell, also claims contact with this same being, Semjaze, one with whom he has implied he had a sexual relationship with. Now, here's the weird rub. Semjaze is almost identical to the name of the lead fallen angel watcher antagonist in the apocryphal Book of Enoch. And I remember being shocked when I first read Meyer's and Bell's accounts, because I'd already looked at the Book of Enoch at university, and I went, these names are the same. Other people have since or before discovered it, but when I first saw it, it jumped out of the page at me. It's like, why are these contactees having contact with the lead fallen angel of Enoch? It seemed just so weird when I finally read those books after reading the Book of Enoch. And of course, the Book of Enoch fills in the details of the narrative, which is only mentioned in passing in one of the Bible's most controversial and fascinating passages. And that's Genesis 6:1-5, which says, and it came to pass when men began to multiply in the face of earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Now, recently, in the past decade plus, the late Michael Heiser, perhaps Christianity's greatest public intellectual of our time, has spent much time rehabilitating the importance of that passage, as well as Enoch, for modern Christianity, because it's not talked about often in churches. So we don't have a whole lot of time left, but it seems like a passage that can just be overlooked and might have nothing to do with UFO belief. But if the type of cosmology that Heiser very convincingly puts forward as being based on biblical texts in his books like The Unseen Realm, the nature of the spiritual realm might be very different and might be far more complicated, and might take into account some of the types of things that we see reported in UFO belief. And there probably isn't a whole lot of time for me to keep going down all of these rabbit holes. But what I will say is none of these things might be true, and none of them are necessarily completely mutually exclusive. For example, one popular version of fairy faith, of the origin of the fairies, is that they were the fallen angels. Similarly, the idea of the watchers, or these beings keeping us, in check on earth, fits very well into some Gnostic beliefs about the archons who keep us trapped. So they're not, that they might seem disconnected, some of the points that I've made, but I don't think that they are necessarily as far apart as they at first seem. I do think it's worth, before either dismissing the UFO phenomenon or before wholeheartedly accepting the popular ET type explanation, that it's it's worth taking into account some of these older antecedents. And again, I think that doesn't mean I don't think most of UFO belief isn't misidentification, or a whole bunch of UFO belief isn't just engineered by popular culture, like I suggested in here, and then people see Venus or something and think it's a flying saucer. And again, a lot of this might be the result even of the type of, or much of the belief might be the result of the type of government psyops of the Paul Benowitz affair. So I'm not saying every aspect of UFO belief might be some of these more occult manifestations which I've talked about, but I think some of the weirder ones are worth looking at within that kind of construct. Now, I'll have a very quick look at any other comments. Flat Rockland says Demonic Reality touches on it a bit, I believe. That's an excellent book by Patrick Harper. Everybody should read Demonic Reality who has any interest in UFOs or the paranormal. Bob Anton talks about the Hale-Bopp cult, so that's Heaven's Gate. There's another one. So yes, there's certainly, these ideas did drive people to do all kinds of things. J. Katz or Aspasia says it may not be true indeed, but the similarities are intriguing, and that's my only intention, to make people think perhaps a little bit outside of the box. So if anybody hears this presentation later or wants to message me anything they think about it, because I'm still workshopping an awful lot of this, and I would love to have anybody's feedback. You can find me on Facebook, friend request me or send me a message, or go to the Talking Weird page on Facebook and message there, or go to theshavermystery.com, which will take you to the Man Who Invented Flying Saucers Facebook page at the moment. And yeah, send me a message. Say you agree or you disagree, or just comment here if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook in the comments afterwards, and I'll keep an eye on those as well, because I would love to hear anybody's type of feedback on this. And again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for those who helped me when there was a little glitch in the middle, which I'll edit out for all our audio listeners later so they won't have to suffer it. And I hope everybody just has a wonderful and blessed new year. And I'm looking forward to you chatting to me, hopefully throughout the year in the Talking Weird chat. And again, always reach out to me if you want to on Facebook or anywhere. I'm happy to talk to anybody. And I appreciate everybody listening, my friends, and those of you who might not know me yet. And until I get to talk to you all again, keep it weird.